This lecture covers the other two constitutional rights discussed in the chapter, which are equal protection and due process. One important distinction to keep in mind in constitutional law is the difference between a state actor and a private actor. Your constitutional rights are only guaranteed to be protected when you work for a state actor. So state actors are actions that are taken by public organizations on behalf or by the government themselves. So for example, the Minnesota State Athletic Director is considered a state actor because Minnesota State University is a public institution. So at Minnesota State, your constitutional rights are protected. In comparison, private actors are non-public organizations, and your constitutional rights are not protected in those organizations that perform no government functions. So the NCAA themselves, just the NCAA, not necessarily the member schools, your constitutional rights are generally not protected at solely private organizations. There are instances in which private organizations can be considered state actors, and there are two ways that the courts have looked at this. The first is the nexus entanglement theory, in which examines the state's involvement with a private company or organization, and if their conduct is enough or their engagement with each other is enough to be considered moved from private to public. In addition, public function theory examines whether or not a court can examine a private organization and see if what they're doing actually takes on a function that the government should be doing or has been doing in the past. So one example of this is private organizations like high school athletic associations who engage in numerous activities to allow high school student athletes to participate in sport and competition. And those organizations, while initially private, have taken on some functions of the government and thus have been considered public entities and state actors. The 14th Amendment contains the Equal Protection Clause, which is designed to protect suspect classes, or in other words, groups of people who have been historically discriminated against based on race in this country. So on the slide, there are three ways in which the court examines cases in which a defendant is accused of violating the Equal Protection Clause. Strict scrutiny is the most rigorous form of scrutiny, meaning that the government looks the most closely at cases that involve suspect classes like race and racial discrimination. So the government has to argue that their action is necessary to achieve a compelling interest, or there's no other way for the government to accomplish the goal than the way it is doing it right now, which may end up discriminating against people. Intermediate scrutiny is basically the lower tier that the state uses regarding gender, alienage. The government has less to prove here. Their actions only need to be substantially related to a goal, and the court looks at, are there other alternatives for the government to reach that goal without discriminating based on gender and so forth. And then rational basis is used when it's non-suspect classifications, so things that are not related to race or gender. And the government only has to show there is a legitimate reason for the rule that's in place. Under the Equal Protection Clause, the court tries to figure out whether policies were intentional or whether they just were created in a result of discrimination. So in terms of intentional policies, de jure discrimination is a law policy that has a clear discriminatory purpose. So for example, in Louisiana, this lawsuit focused on the fact that Louisiana had a policy that basically segregated white schools in black schools and didn't allow them to compete against each other. In terms of de facto discrimination, this is the idea that a law is not necessarily trying to ban certain people, but somehow it ends up doing it anyway. Cases related to affirmative action programs often fall under the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. The goal of these programs is to provide opportunities for underrepresented groups, specifically racial groups who have historically been discriminated against in this country. Since it's used in terms of race, the programs are subject to strict scrutiny evaluation by the courts. So in the case of Grutter versus Bollinger, a white law school student was denied admission to the University of Michigan Law School. She blamed it on the diversity policy the law school had, but the court sided in favor of the University of Michigan, saying it had a compelling interest to have a diverse student body and that it created clear application requirements that created a qualified pool. And once they had a qualified pool, the university was allowed to consider race as part of the decision-making process. The Fifth Amendment focuses on due process, and these are the course of legal proceedings that have been established for the protection and enforcement of private rights so that they're not interfered with by the government. This due process clause is triggered when the government deprives someone of a life, liberty, or property interest. So for example, a life interest is basically the idea that the government can't impose a penalty on someone before they have their day in court. So things like the death penalty are really only considered a life interest. A liberty interest is the idea of someone's damage to someone's reputation that harms them. So defaming or slandering someone in the media that impacts their ability and reputation, maybe to get a new job, could be a liberty interest. In terms of property interest, these are things that contribute to wealth or your estate, your assets. So for example, a college athletic scholarship has been considered a property interest in the past. A physical therapist's or athletic trainer's license to practice is considered a property interest, as is a job contract, are all considered types of property interests. So the starting points for the courts when they're examining due process cases are trying to figure out if there was state action. So did the state or some state actor interfere with a private citizen's rights? So which right has been deprived? A property interest, a life interest, or a liberty interest? And then how was that due process violated? Was it substantive or was it procedural due process? When a person brings forth an allegation of a violation of substantive due process, they're challenging the content and application of the rule. So they're saying that the rule may not have a purpose, the rule isn't fair. So state actors must prove a rational basis. So basically, again, that's the lowest level that state actors have to prove, and they just have to show that there's some sort of rationale or basis for the rules and regulations. So it's relatively easy to do. So on that drug testing scenario, the government could just say, we want to provide a level playing field, we want to protect our student athletes, and that's all they have to say. And generally, courts won't interfere with the internal affairs of voluntary associations like high school sport associations. In comparison, a procedural due process case challenges the way the rule was applied. So courts examine the decision-making process that's followed to determine whether the rule or regulation has violated a person's due process. So in terms of minimum requirements that an organization must do, and this goes along with when it's minor infractions, okay, they have to send the person who is being suspended or fined a statement of the violation. They have to send them a notice of the sanctions. So, and then they have to provide an opportunity for the person who's accused of doing something wrong a chance to plead their case. In comparison, when the offenses are major and the sanctions are severe, there's maximum requirements that an organization must meet for procedural due process. The first is providing a written notice of the hearing, so letting the accused know that they have to come to this hearing. A statement of the charges being brought forth against the accused so that they're aware of what they need to defend themselves against. A hearing in which there's a neutral party that mediates in the conversation. The organization has to provide written or tape recordings of the proceedings, and then the accused has a right of appeal. Again, constitutional rights are only protected from interference by state actors. So this section, the lecture focused on the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause, as well as the Fifth Amendment, which is due process in both substantive and procedural due process designed to give people a fair trial before their rights are denied.